beaten pregnant down the cellar stairs at Christmas. A cowboy found her at dawn and gave her a cradle. The axe handle was cold enough to burn. That's the first thing I remember about that morning. Not the snow, not the sky going pale gray over the ridge, not even the sound I heard from the root cellar, just that handle in my palm, cold as iron in January, and me standing there in the dark yard trying to decide if what I'd heard was a fox or something else. I'd been splitting kindling since before light. Couldn't sleep. That happened more in those years than I'd admit, lying flat on my back in the bunk listening to the rafters settle, the wind pushing at the walls of the place and nothing in me wanting to close my eyes. The ranch was mine outright by then. 7 years of it. Nobody else's name on anything, and there are nights when that kind of a loan gets loud. So I was up and working, and I heard it. Not a cry exactly, lower than that, like someone trying not to make a sound and failing. The cellar door was set into the slope of the hill maybe 30 yards from the house. Caldwell's place had been built that way, the old man who'd owned it before me, so the root cellar stayed below the frost line and kept the stores through March. The door was wood weathered gray, with a leather strap pull and an iron pin through the hasp. The pin was gone. The door was pushed in at an angle, one hinge sprung. I set the axe down and went. She was at the bottom of the stairs. I don't know how to say what I saw there without it sounding more dramatic than it felt, because in the moment it didn't feel dramatic, it felt like the world stopping. She was curled on her side on the cold dirt floor, and she was far gone with child, and there was blood dried in her hair above her left ear, and her lip was split. Her dress was cotton, Christmas red gone brown at the hem with mud and worse. She had no coat, one boot. Her eyes were open. She looked up at me from the floor of that cellar, and she didn't make a sound, and she didn't look scared. She looked past scared, into the place that's on the other side of it where everything goes still. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She said, "I know." I don't know how she knew. I was a stranger in her dark with an axe I'd left outside, but she said it like she'd already decided. I think about that sometimes. Her name was Nora Fitch. Her husband, Harlan Fitch, I'd heard the name, a man who ran a small outfit 3 miles north toward the breaks, had put her down those stairs on Christmas Eve. She told me that plainly a few hours later, sitting wrapped in the good blanket by my stove with a cup of broth between her hands. She said it the way you say the weather. He'd been drinking since noon. They'd argued about the baby coming in January and what they couldn't afford. And he'd knocked her into the wall in the kitchen and then opened the cellar door and pushed her through. She'd crawled to the corner of the cellar and waited out the night. She was 8 months and 1 week along. I carried her up out of there. She wasn't small, she was a tall woman, and the baby made the lift awkward, but I got her arms around my neck and I got one arm under her knees and I brought her up those stairs in the gray Christmas morning light. She didn't help and she didn't hinder. She just held on. Her hair smelled like cold earth and something else I didn't name right then. I got her inside and set her on the bunk nearest the stove and went back out for her boot, which had come off on the 3rd step down. I built the fire up hard. I want to be clear about what I was thinking and what I wasn't. I was 31 years on that ranch in that valley, and I had not brought a woman inside those walls in 11 of them. My wife Cora had been dead 11 years. Gone in a fever the 2nd winter before we'd got anything growing the way we wanted it, and I had kept working and kept the place and kept myself moving because that's what you do and that's what I knew. I was not sentimental about the bunkhouse. I was not sentimental about much. But I understood cold and I understood a woman in trouble and I understood that some things you don't weigh. I boiled water. I found the clean cloth I kept for wounds. I washed the cut on her head, which was shallow enough, and I got broth into her from the pot that had been on the back of the stove since Tuesday. She watched me the whole time. Not suspiciously, steadily, the way a horse watches a man it's trying to figure out. When she'd eaten, she said, "You're Virgil Crane." I said I was. She said she'd heard I was a hard man to know. I said that was probably right. She looked at the fire for a bit and then she said, "I can work. I'm not asking for charity." I said she wasn't going anywhere for a while, and we'd figure the rest out later. She nodded once and went to sleep sitting up, the cup still in her hands. I took it from her without waking her and set it on the shelf, and I sat in the chair by the door for a while and listened to the wind and the fire and her breathing, which was steady and even, and I thought about the kind of man who would push a pregnant woman down a flight of stairs in the dark on Christmas Eve. And I let that thought go because it wasn't useful, and then I went to sleep in the chair. Christmas Day, 1911. She woke before me. I don't know how much before, but when my eyes opened she was up and she'd found the coffee and made it, which meant she'd gone through my stores without asking, and instead of minding that I didn't mind it at all. There was something so matter-of-fact about a woman in my kitchen making coffee that it just sat there without needing a thing said about it. She said good morning without turning around. I said morning back. I asked her how she felt. She said the baby was fine, she could tell. She said she'd been checking on her all night. She knew it was a girl. She said it like that was a fact already established. I asked about the head. She said her head was hard. She turned and looked at me, and there was a bruise across her cheekbone that hadn't been as visible in the dark and a split in her bottom lip, but her eyes were clear. Clear as creek water in October. I fed her again. I fed her well. I had stores enough. Smoked pork and potatoes and dried apple I'd put up in September, and I cooked a real meal that morning, which I did not normally bother with on my own. She ate everything and didn't comment on it and helped wash the plates, moving carefully, one hand always drifting back to her belly to check. I asked what she wanted to do. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "I'm not going back." I said no. Not a question. She looked at me when I said it, reading it. I said, "You're not going back to that." She nodded slowly and looked out the window at the snow. I want to tell you what happened the way it actually happened, which is not the way a story usually goes. There was no clean break where one thing ended and another began. It was January outside and she was 8 months along, and going nowhere was the only sensible fact. So she stayed, and she worked, and I worked, and we moved around each other in that space that had been mine alone for a decade, and it was strange and it was not strange. She knew a house. She knew how to keep things moving, fire, stores, mending, the small constant maintenance of a place that a man alone tends to let slide. She did not ask permission, and she did not apologize for taking up space, and I was glad of both. She slept on the bunk by the stove. I slept in the back room. We talked in the evenings. Not much at first, me less than her, which wouldn't surprise anyone who knew me. She'd ask me something direct, I'd answer direct. Sometimes she'd follow up and sometimes not. She didn't push and she didn't pry and she didn't fill silence with noise. I found that I liked the quiet between us, which is different from the quiet of being alone, because alone quiet has a weight to it that companionable quiet doesn't. She asked me once about the ranch, just, "How long have you worked it?" I told her, built it up from nothing starting at 22, lost my wife at 28, kept on. She said, "Alone all that time?" I said yes. She said, "That's a long time to carry a place by yourself." She said it plain, no sympathy coating on it, just a recognition of fact. I didn't know what to say back, so I didn't say anything, and she went back to her mending, and that was that. But I thought about it later. Carried, that was the word she'd used. Most people would say run or work or hold together. Carried was closer. I went to town the second week of January for flour and lamp oil, and a few other things I was running short on. It was the first time I'd been in since before Christmas. The feed store, the post, the dry goods, I did my rounds. At the dry goods, Walt Edmonds, who ran the counter, said he'd heard I had a woman out at my place. Said it the way men say things when they want you to hear the thing underneath the thing. I said I had a guest who'd been injured and was convalescing. He said Harlan Fitch had been in, saying his wife had run off. I looked at Walt for a moment. I said she didn't run. She was put down a flight of stairs in the dark and left there. Walt went quiet. I paid for my goods and I left. I want to tell you what that felt like, saying that out loud. There's a particular feeling that comes from saying the true thing plainly in the right place at the right time and letting it sit in the room. Not anger, that's too hot. Steadier than anger, like setting a post in the right spot and knowing it won't move. Word got around. I knew it would. A small valley has its ways, and people were going to have their opinions about a bachelor rancher keeping a married, pregnant woman on his property. And I had to decide early whether I cared about those opinions more than I cared about what was right. The answer came to me without much deliberation. I've never been a man who needed the valley's approval to know what kind of man I was. That was decided long before. You spend enough years alone in hard country, you learn fast what you're made of, and you stop looking for a mirror. What I did was, I went to see Abel Marsh. Abel was the county's justice of the peace, a dry, quiet man I'd known for 20 years, and I told him exactly what Nora had told me. I told him about the cellar door with the pin gone, the one boot, the blood on her hair. I told him it was Christmas Eve and she'd been there all night. Abel wrote it down. He said there were things that could be done legally. He said a man had rights to his wife under current law that complicated the matter. He said it plainly, not as approval, just as fact. I said I understood the law. I said Harlan Fitch was not going to go near her again. Abel looked at me for a moment. He knew what I was and what I meant. He was not a stupid man. He said, "That's a lot of weight to carry, Virgil." I said I'd been carrying weight longer than most men in this valley. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. Harlan Fitch came out to the ranch on the 14th of January. I saw him coming from half a mile. He had 2 men with him, which told me he hadn't come to talk. I went inside and I told Nora to stay in the back room and to take the rifle I handed her, and she took it without argument, which told me something about her I was already coming to understand. She was not a woman who needed convincing when the facts were plain. I went back outside and stood on the porch. They pulled up in the yard. Harlan was a thick man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had gone red from the cold or the drink or both. He called out that he'd come for his wife. I said his wife was not available. He said she was his legal property under the law of the state. I let that land in the yard between us, and I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You put her down a flight of stairs in the dark in December with your child in her belly." His 2 men shifted. One of them looked at the ground. Harlan said that was between him and his wife, and none of my concern. I said it became my concern when I found her on a dirt floor in the cold. He said he'd come back with the sheriff. I said he was welcome to do that. I said the sheriff and I had a 20-year acquaintance, and he was welcome to hear everything I'd already told Abel Marsh. I don't know what he saw in my face. Whatever it was the thing that made the decision for him. Men like Harlan Fitch are brave in dark stairwells and drunk kitchens. They are something different in open daylight when someone is looking at them the right way. He turned his horse and left. The 2 men with him didn't look at me when they went. I stood on the porch until I couldn't hear the hooves anymore. When I went back inside, Nora was standing in the doorway to the back room. She still had the rifle. She looked at me for a long moment, that still, clear-eyed look she had. Then she said, "He won't come back." I said, "No." She said, "How'd you know?" I said I'd known men like him all my life, that the only thing they understand is the decision that's already been made. She thought about that, then she nodded once the same way she nodded when a thing was settled. The baby came on the 22nd of January. Mrs. Aldrich from the neighboring spread had been over twice in the preceding weeks. Nora had asked me if I'd mind fetching her, and I had ridden the 6 miles without much fuss. And she came when I went to get her on the night of the 21st, the 2 of us riding back through the cold together with the stars hard and brilliant overhead. I stayed outside. I sat on the porch in my coat and I listened to the sounds from the house and I waited. It was a clear night, very cold, the kind of cold that has a silence in it like held breath. I could see the light in the window. After a while the sounds changed and then there was a different sound, small and insistent and new, and I sat very still. Mrs. Aldrich opened the door a while after and said it was a girl, as Nora had known it would be, and that they were both well. I went in. Nora was on the bunk with the child on her chest. She looked exhausted and present in the way women look after birth, like something enormous has moved through them and they're still feeling the wake of it, but the eyes are completely there, completely on the thing that matters. The baby was small and dark-haired, and her face was the face of something that had just arrived from somewhere far away and wasn't sure yet what to make of the place. Nora looked up at me. She said, "Come see her." I crossed the room and I looked down at that child. I don't have words for what that was. I have never had children of my own. There's a feeling that I don't know the name for something between gratitude and grief and something else that doesn't have a name at all. I said, "She's fine." Nora said, "She is." Then she said quietly, "I want to call her Virginia." I looked at her. She said, "After the place that kept us." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't trust what might come out. I built a cradle. It took me 3 days, working in the evenings after the main work was done. I had good pine boards in the barn, had been meaning to use them for the floor of the new feed room, but the feed room could wait. I cut them clean and joined them tight, and I put a rocker under it that would hold, not the decorative kind that wears out in a season, but the real thing, a proper ark that would last. I finished it with the small plane until the wood was smooth enough that you could run your hand across it without catching anything. I brought it in on a Tuesday evening. Nora was nursing the baby by the fire. She watched me carry it in and set it on the floor near the stove. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Virgil." I said I'd heard rocking helped with sleep, and I'd had the wood anyway. She looked at me, then the way she'd looked at me from the floor of the cellar that first morning. That level, unhurried look that saw something and didn't flinch from what it saw. Only this time there was something else in it. She said, "Come sit down." I sat in the chair. She was across from me with the baby. The fire was going well, the room was warm, the wind was working at the walls the way it always did in January. She said, "I'd like to stay." I said the weather alone made that sensible. She said, "I don't mean the weather." I looked at the fire. She said, "I've known two kinds of men in my life, the kind who takes and the kind who gives. You've done nothing but give since the morning you found me." She paused. "I don't intend to let that go unrecognized." I said I hadn't done it for recognition. She said, "I know that. That's what makes it worth recognizing." The baby made a sound, something between a sigh and a complaint, and Nora shifted her without looking away from me. She said, "I'm not asking anything you're not willing to give. I'm just saying what's true. I've never felt safer in my life than I have in this house. I want you to know that." I had 11 years of alone in my chest, and I had learned to make good use of it, learned to pack it tight and keep it useful. But sitting in that chair in the firelight with that woman across from me and that child and the cradle I'd built sitting solid on my floor, some of that packing shifted. I said, "I'm not an easy man to know." She said, "I know that too." I said, "You said that first day someone told you I was hard to know." She said, "They did." I said, "And?" She said, "I've found it takes about 3 weeks." I laughed. I did not laugh often, and it surprised me to hear it come out, but it came. She was smiling. Not a big smile, she was not given to big ones, which was one of the things I'd noticed. Small and real with her eyes in it. We sat by the fire for a long time after that. That was January of 1912. I'm telling this from a good distance now. There's snow on the ground outside as I speak, which seems right. Some stories want their weather to rhyme. What happened after was what happens when two practical people decide to stop treating a true thing like a temporary arrangement. Abel Marsh came out in April and made it legal with a minimum of ceremony. Nora wore the good dress she'd made herself from cloth I'd brought from the dry goods, and she stood in my front room, and she looked at me through the whole of it, not at Abel, not at the window. Virginia grew. She walked at 11 months and talked early and was opinionated about everything from the age of 2, which I found to be a quality I respected. The valley came around. That's how valleys work. They test you and then they accept what they find. The Aldriches had been on our side from early. The others followed because the truth of what had happened was plain, and most people, when pressed, know the difference between a man who protects and a man who harms. Harlan Fitch left the county that spring. I heard different versions of why. I didn't think about it much. The ranch grew too. Not because I'd changed anything fundamental about how I worked it. I'd been doing everything right for years, but because there was someone who saw that work and said so. Nora noticed things. She'd come out to the fence in the evening sometimes and watch me work, and she'd say, quiet and direct, "That's good fence line. That colt's going to be something. You've got this place built right." Simple things, true things. I have thought since then about what it means for a man to do good work alone for years and never hear from anyone that the work is good. You learn to do without. But there's a weight to doing without that you stop feeling because you're used to it, and you only know it was there when someone lifts it. She lifted it. I think that's the cleanest way I can say it. There's a particular evening I'll come back to when I want to, and it's this one, late October, the year Virginia turned 2. The 3 of us on the porch after supper. The light going gold over the ridge in that way it has in October when the year is winding down and everything is clear. Virginia asleep against my chest, small and heavy the way sleeping children are. Nora beside me, not talking, one hand resting on my arm. Not anything dramatic, not a conclusion or a lesson or any of the things that are supposed to mark moments. Just the light and the quiet, and the particular feeling of a man who has carried a thing for a long time and has, somewhere along the way, been allowed to set it down. The cradle is still in the house. Virginia's children have slept in it. I refinished it once 12 years ago, sanded it back and oiled the wood, but the joins are all original and they're still tight. I built that to last,